So these brain waves can act not just in a general way, organizing large-scale populations of neurons, they can also act in very precise ways too. So we found in prefrontal cortex, as others have found in places like sensory cortex, something called traveling waves. These waves that I'm talking about don't just go up and down like a jump rope. They're not standing waves. They move and travel around cortex. And that's a good thing, because if they were standing waves, that means whole networks would go active and then go silent. Active and silent. And you don't want to disrupt the processing of whole networks of neurons. Instead, these waves travel through networks, only acting on small bits of the network at a time, preserving network integrity and having functions. So here's an example from the lateral prefrontal cortex of an animal performing a working memory task. And as you can see, this is real time, so it's not it's a bit of a noisy signal, but you can see this is millivolts here. You can see the relative to a reference. You can see that this wave doesn't just stay in one place; it's rotating around the lateral prefrontal cortex, and that's exactly what we found. We found that these waves move in very precise ways. They're not like ping pong balls bouncing around the cortex randomly. They follow very specific anatomical axes. And in this particular experiment, this particular animal, we found that there was rotation along this anterior, posterior dorsal ventral axis. And the rotations went in two directions. They went out one way and back the other way, back and forth like that. And that was when the animal was at rest. When the animal started to perform a task, depending on the task, the cognitive demands, the brainwave changed their direction of rotation. So they changed their travel with cognitive demands. Now, traveling waves are interesting because they're super helpful. They can buffer information about elapsed time and recent network activity. And those things are super important for neural computation. You can't do neural computation without this kind of information. So the way to think about it is that if I take a video of a pond and I drop in 4 pebbles one at a time, I can show you a still photograph of that pond, and you could tell me how many pebbles have dropped, where they dropped, and how long ago they dropped. So that's what traveling waves buy you, the ability to buffer information about time and recent network activity. So I could go on and tell you our work about, and last thing I'll just briefly mention, we're also studying how general anesthesia causes loss of consciousness. There's been this tacit assumption that it kind of just turns off your cortex. Well, it doesn't. What it does is it drastically alters brainwave patterns. So here's a bunch of recordings of LFPs and spikes from 4 brain areas of an animal. Again, the LFPs are being the roar of the local crowd, the spikes of individual voices. And what you see, this is real time here, and what you see in the awake state is how the high frequency FM radio chatter as networks form and unform and there's interactions between frequency bands, lower frequencies, higher frequencies, and they're all interacting and forming networks and breaking apart. A lot of chatter going on. Then we anesthetize the animal with propofol, a commonly used anesthetic, and all this high frequency chatter we associate with cognition and we think consciousness is replaced by this low frequency 1 hertz hum. So anesthesia doesn't just turn off your cortex, it shifts it to a frequency mode that's incompatible with cognition and consciousness. And to further test this hypothesis, we found we're able to restore consciousness in animals by high frequency electrical brain stimulation that restore this high frequency chatter to the cortex. We're using these studies to develop safer methods of delivering anesthesia. So, conclusion, there's been a paradigm shift in our understanding of the brain. Your brain is not clockwork. Neural activity underlying cognition is complex, dynamic, and rhythmic. And emergent properties like brain waves organize brain activity, and they play key roles in cognition and consciousness, we believe. Now, I want to clear up, I've talked about this stuff before, so I want to clear up a couple of misconceptions that sometimes comes up. And that is, spikes are important. We're not saying that spikes aren't important. You need spikes to get the waves, and the waves do something. So we love spikes. We study spikes. We study spikes along with LFPs and electrical fields. We're not saying that this higher level does everything. And one little ground rule, we can discuss this if you like, but my ground, no epiphenomenon. No one knows these, like the humming of a car engine. these waves and dynamics are often dismissed as being epiphenomenal. They reflect the brain doing something, but they don't actually do something themselves. Well, no one knows enough about how the brain works to call a signal an epiphenomenon. When I hear, oh, that's an epiphenomenon, what I hear is that doesn't fit my model. And finally, there are no spikes versus LFPs. People often say there's spikes and LFPs. How can you show each do this? They're together. They're part of the spikes and and create electrical fields that contribute to so it's all one big manifestation of the same thing. There's a large proportion of what we're measuring when we measure LFPs and spikes are the spiking combined activity of spiking activity and the electrical fields created by these electrical fluctuations. They're inextricably linked together. And I think the way we need to study the brain is by studying them all, especially and including, everybody has their own level they want to work at, but including this higher emergent level. So I believe that's where cognition and consciousness truly lies.
You showed a picture of the brain with the prefrontal cortex kind of in a purplish color with arrows going back from the prefrontal cortex to the rest of the brain. The question is, this is top-down guidance, but I assume arrows go in the other direction too.
Yep,
that
they do.
Sensory information and memory and all of that emotion are going up. And
absolutely.
So
yeah.
is there a sense of like how influenceable is the prefrontal cortex from the rest of the stuff that's going on, or is there just some fixed kind of program pushing things in a certain way?
Well, so the prefrontal cortex, you're absolutely right. The slide I used was from Berridge and Arnsten. These are beautiful figures meant to just illustrate the top-down influence, but it goes both ways. So the prefrontal cortex is one of the great integrators of your brain. It receives inputs from virtually your entire cortex, except for primary sensory and primary motor cortex. And it's interconnected with all these subcortical structures, like the hippocampus and subcortical structures involved in internal state, rewards, stuff like that. So the prefrontal cortex, much like the hippocampus or basal ganglia, is a place where a lot of information comes together in the brain. But at the same time, the prefrontal cortex sends projections back to all the things it gets information from, so it could play this role as a top-down puppet master. I mean, how much of an influence it has, that depends on moment to moment. There's going to be different modes that, like I think about Leslie Kay's work, where not about prefrontal cortex per se, but these shift in modes of what the brain does. So rat sniffs a few odors, and there'll be like 3 sniffs, let's say. So there'll be 3 bursts of gamma, and then suddenly a shift to beta, like really suddenly. Leslie has a beautiful tattoo on this, by the way. It's really, it's a classic finding in the olfactory bulb. And what's going on in those initial bursts is the first of all, gamma is organizing all the spiking, and the spiking is being driven by this odors and the sniffing. Then the moment that sniffing stops, the brain shifts to these lower frequency beta oscillations, and now that spiking in gamma to the odor is a very local phenomenon. It just gets fed forward into the brain. But when we switch to this lower frequency mode, now all of a sudden connects together the entire olfactory system and the motor system, and it's linked to the decision the animal makes. So that's kind of what the prefrontal cortex is going to be, kind of like that. It's going to be dominated by sensory information when it's flooding in there. And then when the information isn't so strong, they can do other things with it. Like if you could be doing mental calculation in your head, but if I drive a truck at you, that's going to overwhelm your what you're doing, and you're going to jump out of the way, right?
Now, I know there's some a lot of work in psychophysics on this sort of feature integration question, like how do we sort of see this as a holistic thing rather than just a collection of free-floating features, and it has to do with attention, serial attention being paid. Does your story sort of explain that?
Yeah, I wouldn't call it my story. I mean, this started with people like Wolfsinger and Andreas Engel and Pascal Fries and so that. And initial thought was that feature binding. Like, how do you know that your yellow tennis ball is both yellow and round? But that was a good first approximation. But it's not really. First of all, there's not this feature binding problem in the brain so much, because all things like color and shape and locate, they're all multiplexed in the same population of neurons. So there's not really any separate pure color representation versus pure shape representation. But the way to think about it is not feature binding, but network binding. It's binding together networks that need to talk to one another to do a certain thing and form a certain thought or memory at a certain time. So not feature binding, but network binding.
So how does attention do that?
How does attention do that?
Yeah. How does that binding happen? So that I'm seeing, I can sort of integrate everything onto one object, for example.
Right. Well, so you think of the bias competition model of attention from Desmond and Duncan, and also our Miller and Cohn model. The idea was that the spiking activity is going back to the let's take selective attention. Spiking activity is sending top-down signals that make the representation of a certain location in space or a certain feature. They give it extra energy in a winner-take-all network, and that's it. Then that's how you pay attention. Well, now think about it not in terms of just how do the spikes know where to go? Spikes know where to go by these synchronized patterns of oscillatory brainwaves. So this is not anything that's how it's controlled is this brainwave model is more about the infrastructure by which top-down control can act. How the brain figures out, well, this is important or that's important, you need to do this, that's a whole other topic. But that's going to be some representation in the prefrontal cortex, so high-level representation that is expressed in ways that it can be used to drive top-down feedback and produce that goal-directed behavior. That's what the Miller and Cohn model is about. The prefrontal cortex learns the logic of a goal-directed task, but isn't represented in terms of some esoteric logic. It's represented in terms of a map of which neural pathways in the rest of the cortex are needed to do this thing, this goal-directed behavior. And the prefrontal cortex sends this map back to and says, do this, like a traffic cop. So think of these oscillations as a way for these signals to get to where they're going.
Okay, thanks. Just one more question. So I work in AI, and today's AI is kind of still stuck in the Hubel and Wiesel model of the brain. This is how our neural networks work. They're wholly feed forward. They're not dynamic. They can't do like the same versus different task in general, and they don't have ways of abstracting in the ways that you were talking about.
Yeah.
So what do you think is like the key insight that if you were hired by DeepMind or another company that you would like want to give to people who work in neural networks to make them more able to do this?
Yeah, people who work in AI neural networks, one of the things that they're trying to do is to figure out, make AI by figuring out how the brain does it using principles inspired by the brain. Well, if you actually record from the brain is not just doing spiking, and like in spiking network models, there's all these oscillatory dynamics and patterns of coherence. If you want to figure out how the brain's creating intelligence, you got to take into account all these dynamics. I'm not a network modeler. I'm not an AI, so I can't tell you what to do. I'm just saying that if you want to model your networks after the brain, this is the most obvious thing the brain does. We could record it outside the skull 150 years ago. So
I guess just to follow up, that I guess the clockwork version of the brain that you mentioned earlier, versus this more dynamic wave-driven system, is one of them sort of inherently lacking in being able to explain the certain kind of phenomenon? Could we get there just if we still focused on specialized neurons and so on?
Oh, the answer is emphatically no. First of all, we know already you can't explain everything by just spiking alone. So let me go back to the example of the olfactory bulb, right? So the rat's sniffing, and there's these gamma oscillations, and what happens is the spiking is highly organized during these gamma oscillations, and they have a stronger effect on downstream neurons when they're highly organized, right? And you can look on trials in which the animal is performing well versus performing poorly, and the gamma oscillations is stronger and the spiking more synchronized when the animal performs well, and the gamma gets lower, it gets disorganized, and the spikes get disorganized when the animal is performing poorly. Then you have the state change from sensory processing right to the decision phase, and then you get the state change from beta to gamma. So all that stuff I just described, you would never see recording from individual neurons. You cannot see it level individual neurons. So you're not taking into account this stuff. You are missing a lot of currency of what the brain is doing.